Hello, and welcome back to Philosophical Conversations. I'm Giorgi Khuroshvili. We are in the country of Georgia at New Georgian University. And today we discuss Theodor Adorno and post-war Germany. Especially we will deal with the second half of Adorno's life when he returned in Germany. And I'm very glad to be joined in this conversation by Norbert Waszek. Mr. Waszek is a professor of philosophy at Paris 8. Thank you, Professor Waszek, for joining. And let me start our interview by asking about Adorno's return. In 1949, Adorno returned in Germany and helped to shape the political culture of the post-war Germany. How do you think, what was his political and social agenda in post-war Germany?
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. My first time in your country. I'm delighted to be here. Let me begin by a personal note. My academic work is rather on classical German philosophy from Kant to Hegel. But now that I've turned 60, I'm beginning to look back, and I realized that Adorno was important for me as a young man. And the point was that he aroused our generation to look critically back upon the period under Hitler and to have new ideas about it. And so, in a way, as a testimony for my generation, I began to publish 2 or 3 articles on Adorno. So, to come to your question, of course, 49 was very early to come back. Later on, in the 50s, other philosophers came back to Germany. For example, Karl Löwit, who went to Heidelberg. But Adorno was one of the first ones. You might look at it, and he had been away for a long time. He had been in exile for 12 years, which is long. And first he had been for a year to Oxford, where he married his wife, but then they left for the United States, where Horkheimer, his older friend and mentor, provided him with a living working for the Institute of Social Research, which had in a way migrated from Germany to the United States. But of course, the research institute provided them with a living, but they were not really professors at the university, they were researchers. So one, of course, personal motives for Adorno was to get back to the university to be able to teach younger people. And it wasn't just younger people in general and the university. He also wanted to help reconstruct Germany and to educate the young generation democratically. And he even went beyond the university. In the university in Frankfurt, he had many bright students, and many of them became professors. I was too young to be personally in touch with Adorno. Adorno died in '69, and I was only born in '53, so I was only 15. But on the other hand, I have known many professors who were my professors and who had been students of Adorno in Frankfurt and became professors all over Germany. He even went beyond the university, and you can see that by a wide activity for the radio. In the 50s, of course, television didn't exist, so it was mainly on the radio, but we have found out that Adorno gave 600 interviews or lectures on the radio, which is enormous. He came back to Germany in '49. He died in 69, so 20 years, but still 600 appearances on the radio, which makes about 30 a year.
Right.
Every 2 weeks, you could say.
Yeah.
And this is not just a means to get known, it was also for him a way to talk to the wider public, not to everybody, but to the educated audiences, and his appearances on the radio were very popular. Some of them have been made into films later on, documentaries. Anyway, it was a way for him to touch the general public and to make them think critically about the Nazi period. And he was successful in this. I shall later on come back to a little book that was made out of his radio speeches. The German title is Erziehung zur Mündigkeit. You could translate it education towards maturity, towards autonomy. The term Mündigkeit comes from Kant. And so this was just published after his death in the early 70s. He died in 69 and had a wider reception, because on the radio Adorno tried to be more popular than in his philosophical books. The negative dialectics, very difficult, but in the radio he tried to be clearer and to touch the wider public. And education towards maturity would also mean to look back critically upon the period and not to push these things out of memory, as many people try to do.
Absolutely. In Germany, Adorno produced a series of influential works to describe psychological fascist traits. Where are the causes of fascism, according to Adorno?
Adorno was never satisfied with materialistic explanations of fascism. Too many unemployed that turned to Hitler. He always thought it necessary to complete the economic analysis with psychoanalytical analysis. He was always a keen reader of Freud, and actually when Freud had his centenary celebration in Frankfurt, Adorno took an active part to celebrate the memory of Freud. So he was trying to bring in psychological explanations to explain fascism. He often spoke of authoritarian personality, that people would follow orders with blind obedience. And they wouldn't really think about it, whether these orders were justified or not. And so he analyzed also in great detail the psychological phenomena in post-war Germany, when many people tried to repress the memory. I have a nice quotation from Adorno when he had just been back to Germany for 2 months. He came back in October, Christmas holiday in December. He had the time, he wrote a number of letters. He wrote a letter to Thomas Mann, very important, a long letter. Thomas Mann was a Nobel Prize. You don't write to him improvising. The letter is carefully constructed and thought over. He knew the letter would be published later on. So he said, it is funny, Mr. Mann, I haven't come across a single Nazi in Germany. And then he explains himself, not that they all try to say, I have not been, but that they really believe they have not been. It were the others. And so they were kind of pushing back the memory. The psychoanalytical term is repression, Verdrängung. They tried to put away these things. And Adorno, of course, says the younger generation is better. They ask critical questions to their parents, and Adorno encouraged them to do so. What happened? And the older generation, this was also my experience, they never wanted to talk about the war or Hitler. They only came out late night, for example, but they didn't want to talk about it. So Adorno also provided psychoanalytical observations, and he said, for example, it is bad when people integrate too easily into collective entities. They have to remain individuals, and they have to be strong enough to say no. And a philosophical point in this connection, when he wrote in exile the dialectic of reason, dialectic de Aufklärung, he was very pessimistic. He didn't really believe that things could be changed easily. But when he came back, he changed his outlook, and he really tried to convince people of his point of view and to educate the new generations in a different manner.
Yeah. You just mentioned Thomas Mann, and Adorno was rather interested in literature. He very frequently entered to the literary discussions, including with Thomas Mann and as well as Samuel Beckett. So, how do you think, what was Adorno's understanding of literature? What was the role and function of literature according to Adorno?
To begin with Thomas Mann, both of them had met in exile in California. They were living close to Los Angeles, and there was a little interesting group of German exiles that lived in the same place, now an elegant suburb of Los Angeles, Pacific Palisades. And you had a kind of German colony there that some people even called Weimar on the Sea, because it was as if they had transferred to California. And during an evening at Horkheimer's place, both Mann and Adorno met, and at the time Thomas Mann was writing his novel Dr. Faustus, and Adorno helped him and advised him on musical matters. Adorno was also very cultivated in musical terms. He played instruments, and he even had wanted to become a composer or a musician. He didn't realize that, but he was very much interested, and he helped Thomas Mann in this context. Before to speak about literature and Adorno in general, I think before the war makes a difference for him too, the long years of exile. Before, I think his tastes were very classical, elitist. He read Goethe, of course, and even when he came back to Frankfurt being the town of birth of Goethe, he goes into the just reopened Goethe Museum, and he writes to Thomas Mann, "Oh, I've seen the manuscripts of some of the poems, and it's so moving." You see, he was still very strongly based in classical German culture. And of course, the destruction of the war and the destruction of the Jewish population in Germany made a huge difference for him. And he came up with one of his most famous quotations in 1951. He wrote, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." This is often quoted, but it's not often interpreted correctly. He didn't want to say it's forbidden to write poetry now. What he meant to say was the poetry after the war has to take into account what had happened. You cannot read just Goethe on the moonlight and the moods that will arouse by the moonlight. You have to write poetry that will be on the same level as history and take into account what has happened. In this respect, one of the poets he admired most was poet Celan, and he said yes, because this author is writing about what has happened, and he expresses his suffering, and this is legitimate, and this is great poetry for nowadays. So he also, when he, the quotation was from 51, but he changed a bit his mind in 69 in the negative dialectics, where he said, well, I may have been wrong when I put it in this way, and the victims, those have suffered, have obviously the right to express themselves in poetry. In a general way, one could also say that he wanted art to be subversive. And this maybe was not so clear to him before the war, but after the war, he said art in general, music, he also was, of course, a great admirer of music and of Arnold Schoenberg in particular, whom he had also met in California. He said art should not be an amusement and entertainment. Art should be critical and should make people think. In this way, he changed his mind somewhat and took a more productive position towards art.
Adorno also argued that capitalism had managed to liquidate the forces that would bring about its collapse, and that the revolutionary moment when it would have been possible to transform it into socialism had passed. However, today we see Eurosocialism, we see socialist ideologies and socialist policies all around the world. Do you think that Adorno was wrong about the chances of socialism?
Thank you for the question. Capitalism and socialism in Adorno. Of course, Adorno read Marx and other Marxist authors, but he was never a dogmatic Marxist. I would also like to underline the fact that as opposed to Horkheimer, his older friend and mentor, Adorno's political insights were not always very good. He, for a long time, believed that Nazism would soon be over. Horkheimer pushed him to leave Germany. You have to get out now, and so on. And Adorno was rather hesitant, and he came back even on several visits to Germany, which shows that he didn't quite understand what was going on. And so the political the positions of Adorno were not always the clearest. He read Marx and he wrote philosophically about it, but he was not very dogmatic about Marxism, and his political role in Germany, he himself did not really push the students to go on rebellion. This was a conclusion that some of his students took from him, and in fact, at the end of his life, Adorno had many difficulties with radical students. When in '69, I think, students occupied his own building in the university. He was not happy at all, he didn't like it, and he was in conflict with some of his students. So we cannot, to look back on it from our perspective, decades later, he did not really, we cannot really say that he wanted to have a socialist government or something like that. But of course the question, a social question, remains. this is also, of course, the point about the second and third generation of the Frankfurt School, that is to say, second generation Habermas, third generation Honneth. Honneth has just published a book on socialism where he's trying to separate the things that are past, that we have to get rid of, and he's trying to say, but something remains. There is something like a new social question. If you look at it from the German point of view, Germany is a very rich country, but there are many people that are poor. And it's not so much only a question of social conditions, material living standards, it's also a question of how the poor can participate in political life, how they can have access to full citizens' rights, how they can be outspoken. And so it's not just a question of how much they've got to live on, it's more a question of how can they articulate themselves, how can they be part of the society and of political life. And this, I think, remains as a question, and in this respect I agree with authors such as Honneth. Certain things from socialism we can't use any longer, but the intention remains, what can be done about the poor.
Adorno is also known for his critique of the cultural industry. He felt that the entertainment industry of the modern society is just mechanical, formulaic, and dominating at the workplace. What is the cultural industry, and how does Adorno defend his vision of it?
Thank you. He, as I had said before the war, he had very classical tastes, elitist tastes in literature, in music, and in painting. When he came to California in particular, they also spent some time in New York, Horkheimer and him, but they went to California. Why did they go to California? Because some of the German exiles were obviously hoping to work for the cultural industry. Los Angeles also means Hollywood. For example, the composers hoped to earn a living by writing music for films, and others were hoping to write scripts for films. And of course, one of the exiles in California was Brecht, also hoping to make a living out of Hollywood. This did not work very well, but anyway, it gave Adorno a chance to observe Hollywood and all the cultural industry that goes with it. When culture becomes a merchandise, it can be bought and sold, and it is a part of, it's a way of making money. Of course, in this respect, he disapproves of the cultural industry, and he ascribes a more challenging role to art, to arouse people, to wake them up, to make them think critically. So he never really approved of or appreciated very popular films. He didn't like popular music. He thought music should be elevated and should also elevate people to another perspective. But he did analyze how the cultural industry in the American sense, in the Hollywood sense, worked, and that it is, well, an industry. It's no longer culture in the elevated sense, it's an industry. It's a way to make money, and it's also a way to distract people from what they should really be thinking about.
Professor Waszek, thanks for the interview and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, my pleasure.